So we're in this series of studies that we're calling Rough Crowd, and we're calling it that because that really is, if we're honest, that's who we are. We're a fairly rough crowd, and I say that because on the outside, we try to make it look like everything is fine. On the outside, we try to look like everything is all together, but we all know on the inside, it's not quite that way. On the inside, you know that you may be hurting, you know that you may be frustrated, you know that life is rough, and on the outside, everything looks fine, but on the inside, sometimes we're struggling. And so that's why when we hear a song like that, we connect with some of the lines. Maybe you connect with the whole phrase of, I just want to free myself from all of this misery. I mean, what's going on, I wish I could somehow find some relief. I wish I could somehow move on from whatever it is that we're experiencing right now. Or maybe you resonate with this line, I just find that I tend to be my own worst enemy. And I do stupid things, and I say stupid things, and I kind of rush things, and I don't wait long enough, and I get in a hurry, and I just tend to be my own worst enemy. And because of that, we tend to be a pretty rough crowd. And so today I actually want to go to school on a couple, a husband and a wife, who tended to be their own worst enemies because they would say stupid things and they would make stupid choices and they would rush things along and give up too soon. And so I want to go to school on this couple and just kind of figure out, okay, what is it that they were doing that was causing issues in their lives? What can we learn about ourselves? And then even beyond that, what can we learn about how God responds to us when we continually, over and over again, end up being our own worst enemies? So let me ask you to grab a Bible. If you don't have one with you, there should be some of the seats there around you across all of our locations. Genesis chapter 12, it's very front of the Bible, page 10 in the Bibles there at your seats, or you can go to the Bible app on your phone, however you want to do it. Genesis chapter 12, page 10, and we're actually going to go way back in time today, several thousand years before the birth of Jesus, and we're going to look at this older married couple whose names are Abram and Sarai. Later their names changed to Abraham and Sarah. And what you need to know about Abram and Sarai is they are rough. They're just a rough couple. And when we first meet Abram, he's actually working in the family business. Now, the family business is making idols. They made gods out of different objects. And so he had this store, and you could go in there and you could buy a god for pretty much whatever you needed. If you had a problem, you would go find Abram, and you would buy a god to take care of whatever issue you were facing. And so let's say you're a farmer, and it hadn't rained much, and you need rain, and so you would go to Abram's store, and you'd say, do you have anything for me that can make it rain? And so you'd buy a little idol, and you'd take it home, and you'd set it on your mantle, and you'd pray to it 3 times a day, and hopefully it would make rain. Or if you had a problem with mice around your house, then you'd go to Abram, and you'd say, do you have anything that can take care of mice? And he'd give you a little idol, and you'd put it on your mantle, and you'd pray 3 times a day to it, and hopefully it would take care of your mice problem. If your husband is always a jerk, you'd go to Abram and say, Abram, and I don't know if he would have anything for that or not, but that's what Abram did. He made idols, and his dad made idols, his dad made idols. It was the family business that'd sell them in this little town. Now, I don't know this for sure. I can't prove it, but my guess is that Abram is actually a spiritual person. I mean, he makes idols, and essentially, it seems that he knows that there's something out there, maybe someone out there that's greater than him. He's not in control of everything, and so I think he's a spiritual person, and not the one in control, but I know that there's someone out there who is, and he's just trying to make a connection with whoever, whatever that might be, and he's not doing it the right way, but he is spiritually aware. And my guess is that's true for a lot of us. A lot of us would say, you know what, I don't know a whole lot about God, don't know everything for sure about God, but I do know there's something out there that's greater than me. And if that's you, then I'd say, you know what, that's a great place to start, because like Abram, it means you're spiritual, and that's a great place to start. Now, not only is Abram spiritual, a couple other things you need to know about him. Again, he's just old. He's getting old. He's 75 years old. He's getting along in life. And I think it's safe to say that Abram thought that at this point in his life, this was how he was going to spend the rest of his life. He was going to be working in the family business, making idols for the rest of his life. I mean, let's be honest, when you're 75, are you thinking about going back to school? Are you thinking about starting a brand new career? And at 75, you're thinking, this is kind of it. I'm going to go ahead, and this will be the rest of my life. I'm going to live it out with the family business. And one more thing you need to know about Abram and Sarai, they had no children. Never had any children at all. All their lives they'd wanted children, but at the age of 75, she's 65, they've kind of given up hope on having children, and they've accepted that this is the way it is. This is the lot, the cards they've been dealt. They're just going to go on and do the best with their lives, the rest of their lives, and then something happens. On just this kind of very ordinary day in the life of Abram, something happens. God actually steps in and he changes everything. And that's where we pick up the story. Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. The Lord had said to Abram, now let me just stop there real quick. The Lord had said to Abram kind of shows up at work like every other day he showed up at work. He's making idols, but this day something happens and everything is changed. And God says, Abram. And I don't know how God said it. I mean, maybe there was an angel speaking for him. Maybe it was a voice from heaven. Maybe it was a burning bush. Maybe he wrote something on a wall. I mean, God could do any of those things. He's God. He can do whatever he wants and speak however he wants. And he spoke to Abram, and just like he has the ability to speak to you or to me in this very ordinary, normal day, and everything changes because God actually shows up. And all of a sudden, Abram's life is turned upside down. And my guess is, at some point, God is going to show up in your life as well. And most likely, he has already shown up. He's been ringing the doorbell. You just haven't been paying any attention. And when he does show up, most likely, it's not going to be with a burning bush in your yard. It's not going to be an earthquake. It's not going to be a pillar of fire in the sky. He's just going to show up in a very ordinary day, and you're going to have a sense that somehow God is present in your life. And so here's what happens. Again, chapter 12, verse 1. The Lord had said to Abram, leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family. Go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you, curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you. So again, Abram's just at work. He's doing his thing, and except that day, God actually shows up and said, hey, Abram, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go. I want you to pack everything up, and I want you to leave, and I want you to follow me. And I would think that Abram had some interesting questions for God, like, where are we going? Where do you want me to follow you? Follow you where? And God's answer really is just, I'll show you. Just come, I'll show you, which really is vague. I mean, it would be nice to have more details when God says, follow me. And then God throws in a promise. He says, look, if you agree to follow me, then I know that you're 75 years old. I know you don't have any kids, but I'm going to make a great nation out of you. I'm just telling you, if you follow me, you'll have so many kids, you won't even be able to count your descendants. I'll make you a great nation. And Abram's just this normal guy at a normal job on a normal day, and he's spiritual, but he's not a spiritual giant. I mean, he's making idols and selling them in the mall. And so what would you do if God showed up in your life that way? What would you do if you're on your way to school and God shows up and he speaks to you? You're on your way to work, or you're on your way to the store, and all of a sudden God begins to speak to you. And he says, I've got a plan for you. It's not what you'd thought. It's not going to be what you would expect, but I just want you to follow me. I mean, what would you do in that situation? And maybe you'd say it's happened to you. I mean, have you ever had this sense that God is asking you to do something? I mean, what happens when you believe God is telling you to do something? Have you ever had that kind of experience and where something in your head or something in your heart, where your heart just starts beating faster because you heard something? Maybe you heard it at church. Maybe you read it in a book. Maybe somebody said something to you, and your heart just starts beating faster because you have this sense that God is telling you to do something. And maybe he's saying, quit that job, or maybe start a new job, or maybe he's saying to you, hang on in your marriage a little bit longer, whatever it is. You just have this sense that God is asking you to do something. And just like he did with Abram, God, when he speaks into your life, the thing is, he doesn't give you a whole lot of details about it. He just says, follow me. I just want you to follow me. And he's not going to give you a playbook. He's not going to say, you know what, tomorrow, this is what I'm going to do. And then on Tuesday, here's what's going to happen. And then on Thursday, it's all going to come together. He doesn't do that. Usually he just says, I just want you to follow me. If you got questions, he says, just follow me. Follow me. We'll figure it out as we go. You follow me, which, again, isn't always a lot of help. We'd love to know a few more details. And here's what Abram does, verse 4. So Abram departed as the Lord had instructed. In other words, Abram did it. Abram did just what God asked him to do. He went to God and he said, I'm in. I'll do this. And can you imagine? My guess is it was a pretty rough conversation when Abram went home for dinner that night. And he comes home, and Sarai's making dinner, and he sits down, and he says, oh, Sarai, honey, you really look beautiful today. And oh, by the way, you'll never guess who showed up at work today. And God actually showed up. And she says, which one? And he said, well, come to find out, there is just one God. I mean, who knew? We've been making all of these idols and gods. And what did God say to you? Well, he actually said that we ought to leave the house, we ought to leave the farm, leave the family business, leave everything behind, and get in the minivan and just go, follow him. And where is he going to take us? Go where? And well, he said, just follow me. I'll show you later. And well, what did you tell God when he said that? What did you do, and what have you done? And he said, well, I told him we would go. I said we would actually go. I mean, there's just no way that's going to be a good conversation around the dinner table. But probably what smoothed it out at that point is when Abram threw in the part where he said, wait a minute, Sarai, before you get too upset, before you say no, understand God also told me that I'm going to have a big family, that there's going to be so many descendants, we're not going to be able to even count them. Sarai, what he said to us is we're going to have a baby. And as soon as he says that, there's something that clicks inside of her, and her heart begins to beat faster, because the only thing Sarai's ever wanted is the one thing she never had, which is a baby. And now she's 65 years old, and Abram comes home, and he said, God told me something, and she's got hope for the very first time and the promise of having a baby. And she says, what are we waiting for? Load up the wagon. Let's go. Well, I'll do anything to have a baby. And so they load up the wagon, and they follow God. Now, fast forward in time, not 10 days, not 10 weeks, not 10 months, fast forward 10 years. And guess what hasn't happened yet in 10 years? 10 years later, there's still no baby. 10 years later, there's no baby. I mean, have you ever been absolutely certain in your heart that God is telling you to do something, and so you do it? You follow what you think is his direction, his instructions. You do it the best you can, and at some point you look around and you go, it just feels like God's forgotten about me. And you say, no baby. 10 years later, God, it feels like you've forgotten all about what you had asked me to do. And 10 years, still no baby. And I think we get frustrated in that situation. Abram gets frustrated, and so he has a really tough conversation with God, and God's been good to Abram. He's been good to Sarai, but there's still no baby. And so go to chapter 15, a couple pages over, chapter 15, verse 1. Here's the conversation between God now and Abram. 10 years later, sometime later, the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision and said to him, do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you, and your reward will be great. Verse 2, but Abram replied, O sovereign Lord, what good are all these blessings? So he's frustrated. Now he's expressing that, God, what good are all these blessings when I don't even have a son? Since you've given me no children, Eliezer of Damascus, a servant in my household, he's the one that's going to inherit all my wealth. You've given me no descendants of my own, so no one of my servants will be my heir. And translated here, he's just saying, hey, what's happening, God? You told me, 10 years ago, you told me you would have a son, and now I'm 10 years older, still no baby. And do you realize it's okay to have a hard conversation with God? God can handle it. God can actually take it. Here's God's response to Abram, verse 4. Then the Lord said to him, to Abram, no, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir. Then the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have. God pulls Abram out of his tent and he says, look at the stars, more stars than you can even begin to count. And Abram, when you have a son, you will have more descendants than there are stars in the sky, more descendants than you can count. And interesting little side note here, Abram, his whole focus is on one son. That's all he's after, one son. What's interesting is God, as he talks about the stars in the sky, he's actually interested in you and me, because we're part of that. And we come from the line of Abram, and you kind of look at it and you go, we were some of those stars. God is focused on us. Abram's focused on one son. And so again, Abram buys in. He goes, okay, I'll keep following you, God. But Sarai kind of does the math. She starts looking at things and she says, you know what? I'm 10 years older now. I'm 75 years old, and he's 85 years old. And yeah, God told him that he would have a child, but there was no mention of me in all of this. What about me? And so our hopes are crushed, and a lot of us have been there, where you go, okay, God, what are you doing? And we don't see anything happening, and you were sure that God was asking you to do something. You were sure that he was going to do it, but it didn't happen. And so Sarai, she's tough. I mean, she's rough. And she's not going to give up here. And so she comes up with a plan. Thing is about her plan, it's a bad plan. It's just a really, really, really bad plan. And she decides to take matters into her own hands. So go to chapter 16, verse 1. Here's her plan. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had not been able to bear children for him, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "The Lord has prevented me from having children. Go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her." And Abram agreed with Sarai's proposal. Let me just ask you, have you ever made a really, really, really bad decision? I mean, you were maybe emotional in the moment, you were sad, and you make this quick decision, and you reacted in the moment. Maybe you had a little bit too much to drink, and you come up with this really, really, really bad plan. And Sarai's plan kind of goes like this. She says, "Hey, Abram, husband, I have this idea. How about you sleep with my pretty young maid, and there's something wrong with me, and so that's the plan." And Abram goes, "Okay, your 20-year-old young Egyptian maid, I can do that." And so he agrees to the plan. And this is actually a story for all of us that have ever lowered our expectations about what God might do in our lives. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you thought God was going to do one thing, didn't look like he was ever going to get it done, and so you lowered your expectations of what you thought God might actually do? I mean, you thought God was going to give you a baby, but still no baby. You thought he was going to get you that top job, but still no job. You thought he was going to help you ace that test at school, but you didn't ace it. You thought he was going to save your marriage. Didn't happen. You thought that he was going to bring you Mr. Right, but Mr. Wrong came along. You thought that he was going to heal your mom's cancer, but she still has cancer. You thought he was going to help you break that addiction, but the addiction is still there. You thought he would stop the bullying, but the bullying is still happening. I mean, this is a story for all of us that have ever lowered our expectations about what we think God is going to do in our lives. And how are you supposed to respond when you think God is going to do this and he's not doing it? You're not seeing it happen. I mean, how are we supposed to respond when God doesn't seem to come through for us and when he doesn't seem to follow through and hold up his end of the bargain? And can I tell you a couple things not to do? One of the things not to do is don't take matters into your own hand and then run ahead of God. Come up with your own plan. And I mean, things aren't going the way you hoped, and so you kind of decide, okay, well, I can step in, God, and help you get here. I can come up with a plan. I don't know what you're doing, God, but I know what I can do, so how about I take over? How about I jump in and just take over? I'll help you out a little bit here, God. And have you ever done that? I know I have, and Sarai does that, and she doesn't even ask God about there's no mention that she talked to God about the plan. And so many of my plans, I guess I should have talked to God about that plan. And there's no mention at all of her talking to God. And her heart is crushed. And at the moment, she comes up with a really, really, really bad plan. But it's not just Sarai's problem here with the plan. I mean, Abram should have stepped up here, but he didn't. Abram should have said, you know what, Sarah, I know you're hurting right now. I know this is a really difficult time, but this is not what we're going to do. This is not a good plan. But he didn't step up. He didn't say, you know what, Sarah, let's step back and slow down and think about this a little bit. And apparently he didn't want to argue anymore. And so he says, hey, whatever you want, I'll sleep with your maid. And which is the second thing not to do when you find yourself disappointed with God and somebody's kind of sucking you into a plan is don't be passive and do nothing. Don't step back and just do nothing at all. I mean, there's no way that Abraham heard this plan and thought to himself, Sarai, this is brilliant. This is such a good idea. This is great. Makes so much sense. It's going to end well. Abram had a choice. Either he could be passive or he could go with the plan and sleep with the maid, or he could have stepped up and said, I know you're hurting right now. This isn't a good idea. But it's not a time to go quiet. It's not a time to be passive and just kind of go along with the flow. And which one other thing not to do, don't do the wrong thing in order to accomplish God's plan. I mean, never. Don't sin in order to accomplish what you think is God's plan. I mean, you're married. I'll hear this one often. I mean, you're married, but you've decided you're married to the wrong person. And you know what you're doing. You found somebody new, and you know what you're doing technically is adultery, but you'll say things like, well, God knows my heart, and he knows how miserable I am in my marriage, and besides, I think I married the wrong person, and anyway, I'm in love with the other person now, and so I think God would understand if I leave my marriage for this other person. I think God will be okay with this, won't he? I'll just tell you, there is no way God is ever going to look at you and go, hey, you know what? For the rest of the world, most everybody else, that would be adultery. But for you, this one time, it's okay. Why don't you go ahead and go for it? I mean, it's never, ever, ever going to happen. And God is never going to say, go ahead to sin in order to accomplish my will. It's not going to happen. And sometimes it's true. Sometimes we are our own worst enemies because we come up with these plans. We run ahead of God, come up with these plans, and let's see how things turned out. Chapter 16, verse 4, Abram had sexual relations with Hagar. She became pregnant, but when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat her mistress Sarai with contempt. Then Sarai said to Abram, this is all your fault. I put my servant into your arms, but now that she's pregnant, she treats me with contempt. The Lord will show you who's wrong, you or me. Everything begins to blow up, and Sarai says, I thought I had a good idea. Initially, it was looking good, but looking back, it wasn't a good idea. Abram, this is your fault. I don't know why it is. It's just your fault, and everything is blowing up, and they're just normal people. Normal husband and wife in a really hard situation, and we don't always do well when we're in a rough spot. And besides, in a strange kind of way, Abram is partly to blame for all of this. She's right. I mean, he had a chance to stop the plan, but he was passive. He didn't step in. He should have stepped in and protected Sarai. He should have stepped in and protected their marriage, but he didn't. He could have done better, but that's not what he did. Another sermon for another day, but you need to know that God takes care of Hagar. She has a little boy. She named him Ishmael, and God made something good out of something bad. But understand, Abram sleeping with the maid was never part of God's plan. And because it was never part of God's plan, life got rough for everybody involved. It got hard for everybody involved, which is kind of the way it goes. We run ahead of God. We make our own plans. Life gets rough. And why does it get rough? Is God punishing us because we didn't follow his plan? And no, that's not what's happening. God knows the best way for us to go. And he had the best plan. And then our plan, we settled for less and so much less that now our lives are rough. And I mean, let's be honest. If we could go back and look at the biggest regrets that we have in our lives, I think most of the time we'd attribute it to the fact that we came up with another plan. I mean, we came up with another plan. We didn't wait on God's plan. And then life just starts blowing up, and we find ourselves frustrated and angry at God. And I mean, to be honest, what we do is we come up with our own plan, and then all of a sudden we say, God, why don't you jump on board with my plan? I know you had this plan up here. I've kind of lowered expectations. I've got a plan for getting here. Now, God, why don't you jump on board with me? Why don't you get on board? The train's leaving. God, come on, get on board, because it's leaving with or without you, God. And then the train jumps the tracks and everything burns and our lives blow up. And then what we do is we look up at God and we shake our fist at him and we say, God, why didn't you jump on board and make my plan work? It was never his plan. And you spent so much of your life being angry with God because your plans didn't work out the way you thought that they would. And God had a plan, but you couldn't wait for it. And ever been frustrated with God? And maybe it's not God you ought to be frustrated with. And you're shaking your fist at him. But I understand that. I've been there. And so 15 years later, So now it's 25 years from the first time God talked to Abram. God comes to Abram and Sarai again. This time it's God's time. Look at chapter 17, verse 15. Verse 15, chapter 17, then God said to Abraham, his name is changed now, regarding Sarai, your wife, her name will no longer be Sarai. From now on, her name will be Sarah. And I will bless her and give you a son from her. Yes, I will bless her richly, and she will become the mother of many nations. King of nations will be among her descendants. Now remember, Abram is 100 years old. She's 90 years old. So here's Abram's reaction, verse 17. He bowed down to the ground, but he laughed to himself in disbelief. How could I become a father at age of 100, he thought? And how could Sarah have a baby when she's 90 years old? So Abram said, God, may Ishmael live under your special blessing. Ishmael, that was the other plan, God, we came up with, and surely it's the right plan. God replied, no, Sarai, your wife, will give birth to a son for you. You will name him Isaac. And Abram just kind of laughs. He scoffs. Go over to chapter 18, verse 11. We see Sarah's reaction to all of this. Verse 11, chapter 18. Abram and Sarah were both very old by this time, and Sarah was long past the age of having children. So she laughed silently to herself and said, how could a worn-out woman like me enjoy such pleasure, especially when my master, my husband, is also so old? So she laughs too. Then the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? Why did she say, can an old woman like me have a baby? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I'll return about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. 100 years old, 90 years old, and God says, is anything too hard for me? Is anything too hard for the Lord? And fast forward a year, and they have their son. And fast forward several thousand years, and all of a sudden it's life for you and me today. This is your moment, so let's talk about your life. I mean, what mountains are you facing? Abram and Sarah, they wanted a baby, and they're 100 years old, 90 years old. That was a huge mountain to face. What mountain are you facing? And where have you been tempted to lower your expectations, where God says this, and you go, I don't think that's going to happen. And so you jump in, and you begin to help God out with your own plans. And where have you been running ahead of God? And where have you been coming up with your own plan? And then you're asking God to jump aboard your plans, not his plans, your plans. Where have you been shaking your fist at God because somehow your plans have been blowing up on you? And can I tell you what is true? What I know to be true is that Jesus knows all about you. He knows you better than you know yourself. And Jesus knows what you can become, and that's why he sets his expectations high, and you don't. That's why you set your expectations low. See, Jesus sees you as he intends you to be, not as you are. You see yourself as you are. He sees you as he intends you to be. And here's where the whole problem happens in all of our lives and why our lives blow up. It's in this gap between where you are and where Jesus intends you to be. And in that gap, that's when we begin to lower our expectations. In that gap, that's when all of a sudden we go, oh, I don't think I'm ever going to get to that place. So let's lower expectations. Or, God, it's not happening fast enough. I'll come up with my own plan to get there. It's in that gap that we find ourselves getting into trouble. And Jesus says to you, he says, look, I'm going to change some things in your life. I'm going to get you to where I intend you to be, things that you think are unchangeable. And in that gap, we kind of question and we begin to bail out. And we say, that's impossible. God, how in the world are you going to change that part of my life? How are you going to fix this part of my life? Way too big of a mountain to climb, God. It's never going to happen. And I think Jesus looks back at us and he says, is anything too hard for the Lord? Is anything too hard for me? And he says, I know you're rough, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to take everything from your past, and I'm going to take everything that's happening today, and I'm going to combine all of that, and I'm going to use that to make you into the person I intend you to be. And I'm going to change your corner of the world, and I'm going to bless your family. I'm going to bless your marriage and bless your friendships. So just follow me. I will get you there, but you need to follow me. And so what's your mountain? I mean, we all have one, and I don't know what you're going to do to go get over that mountain. You don't even know what you're going to do to get over that mountain, but we're never asked to figure out a plan to get over that mountain. We're just told to follow Jesus. He just says, follow me. And the reason he says, follow me, is he's been on the other side of the mountain. He knows what's on the other side of the mountain. And so rather than fix your eyes on the mountain itself, why not fix your eyes on Jesus? Because he knows what's on the other side. And when he says, follow me, he says, I know how to get you over this mountain. I can get you there. Follow me. Don't come up with your own plan, and just follow me. And can I just tell you who we are at LCBC? We're a crowd of people who are facing big, big mountains. And we're not good enough to come up with our own plan to get over that mountain. We're not saints. We're more sinners than we are saints, and we're messy, broken people, and we're still making mistakes, and we come up with our own plans, and our lives blow up. But Jesus is inviting us still to follow him. And are you still a mess? Then join us, so are we. And are you coming to the realization you're not good enough to get over the mountain yourself? Join us, we can't either. And are you guilty of wrongdoing? So are we. And so I just invite you to join our rough crowd. I mean, why would you choose to do this journey over your mountain alone? And Jesus is taking our brokenness and our foolish actions and our bad decisions and our really, really bad plans, and he's giving us hope, and he's taking our shame and our failures and the things that we try to cover and hide, and he's bringing them out of the darkness, and he's rescuing us. And why keep going the same old way? Why not stop being your own worst enemy? And why not follow Jesus? And why not choose to join us? And together, let's follow Jesus. And, you know, Abraham and Sarah, they were rough. They were a rough couple. But I actually think they would have fit in well here. And I think you would fit in well also. And I think Darby fits in well at LCBC. Darby knows what it's like to make foolish plans. He knows what it's like to make foolish decisions. And so I want you to listen to Darby's story. And as you listen, just understand, Jesus sees us as who he intends us to be, not who we are now. And so stop being your own worst enemy. Instead, follow him. Follow Jesus.
My parents always made me go to church. Like, as long as I lived in their house, I had to go to church. So I always had that foundation. I felt like I always knew the Bible. My heart wasn't in it. My parents switched churches when I was about 15, and I didn't get into the new youth group, and just ended up getting into, a lot more trouble, running from the police, just general bad teenage vandalism kind of, what trouble can we get into next? There was always this voice that was like, at some point I have to get back to Jesus, but it's not going to be today. Got together with a buddy and we actually started drinking before we even decided to go out to the bar. Then we went to the bar, spent many hours at the nightclub, and then on the way home, the cop started to pull me over, and I turned down an alley and got away until I got to the other end of the alley, and there was a car blocking it so that I couldn't get through, and I had to stop. 6 officers with guns pointed at my head, sobers you up real fast. I immediately knew the whole issue was, it wasn't even an alcoholism or an addiction issue. It was just more of a anger and distance from God. Started on my own going to church, and that's actually where I met my wife. We immediately got physical. We immediately moved in together. We bought a house together. Then we got engaged. About the worst thing you can do is when you're trying to get your life in order is to begin a relationship because you're a mess. I hadn't fixed any of the problems. I was still the problem. I still wasn't listening to Jesus. And I was the mess. And so unfortunately, the relationship was very strained really from the beginning because of who I was. I just was now an angrier person because I was not self-medicating. I would just blow up. I say that I went from abusing alcohol to being an abusive husband, and I hated myself. I mean, really the issue wasn't her. It was, I hated myself, I hated my life. I decided, well, what fixes everything but to have children? So we decided to have children and, make everything 100 times worse. But it really was after one particularly horrible fight, the next day Melissa came to me and she's just like, we can't do this anymore. This isn't healthy. This isn't healthy for you or me, but most importantly, this is not healthy for the children. And I knew she was right. But I just started crying out to God, I think for the first time in my life, change what you have to change. And that's where I think it really began. Sort of out of the blue, a friend of my wife's invited us to LCBC. We heard Pastor David's message, and it was about struggling just to get through the day. And he shared a story about something he did with his family, and it was the story about how he left his family at the parade in Disney World. And I thought, that's something stupid that I would do. So the whole idea that here's a pastor who's being real about his situation that I can now relate to just blew me away. And I just really started to read the Bible more, started to pray more, and I just started seeing different areas where he had just provided and protected me, certainly where I didn't deserve. I mean, I still had my family, and I didn't deserve to have my family. I had a friend, his name was Darren, and just shared with him a little bit of my faith as I was growing in mine, but was never comfortable talking about my faith. But he developed cancer. And then when I found out he went to hospice, I was a coward, and I didn't even go visit him because I didn't want to see him like that. And then he died very quickly, and I thought, that felt like it was my fault that maybe he wasn't in heaven. So I started praying to God, show me that Darren's with you and somehow okay. And I get it, that you have to know Jesus to go to heaven. I ended up going to his memorial service, and the pastor said that right before Darren died, he accepted Christ as his Savior. And it was like God's way of saying he's okay and he's with me. A few months later, my uncle was taken to hospice, who I hadn't talked to in years. I thought, well, here we go. So we went in, and he was not conscious at that point. And I thought, well, what do you do when he's not even awake? And so I started praying right there in the moment. I was like, okay, God, if you want something to happen, it's got to be you, not me. Next thing I know, he opened his eyes, and before I knew it, I had his hand, and I'm asking him if he wants to accept Christ as his Savior. I'm asking him if he wants forgiveness for his sins. I'm asking him if he wants to know where he's going for eternity, and if he wants Jesus to stand with him. And he says yes to all these things. Next thing I know, I'm praying. We're walking out, and my dad just looks at me, and he's like, "What was that?" And I don't know. God was just like, "This is what I want to do with your life. I want to use you in this capacity to bring people to Christ." From that, just fell in love with talking to people about how you are introduced to Jesus, or what a walk with Christ looks like. The song that LCBC's been playing, Reckless Love, has this line in it that says, when I was your foe, still your love fought for me. And when I first heard them sing that, I just thought, well, that's me. There was so many times when I was so far from God, and he fought for me, even though I wanted no part of him. And just to see how our marriage has gotten better, the fact that, again, that I have my wife and that my children, who I know I don't deserve them, just work harder every day to be grateful for what he's blessed me with. I look back on when I hated my life. I hated every aspect of my life, and now God's transformed the whole thing into something that he can use and has meaning, and to take all my shame and all the things that I don't want people to know, and actually use it and share it. I've lived with him, and I've walked without him, and I never want to live without him again.